women. Discriminated, violated, and threatened. A timeless suppression of the weaker sex. But can't we put a pause on their protests when we have another pressing issue to worry about? Like, say, a global pandemic? A protest polemic representing a postmodern threat to social order, defying lockdown and social distancing between a large number of people's contentious gathering of social confrontation against police disciplining the masses to reinstate social order for health and safety. However, COVID-19 has ironically heightened police violence. In this video essay, I'll explore how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the policing tactics of public pandemic protests by threatening protesters' human rights and circumventing public order laws during the Sarah Everard protest. The 3rd of March in London, Sarah Everard walked home alone from a friend's house talking to her boyfriend on the phone. At 9:30, she disappeared. Her body was found on March 10th in the woodlands in Kent. As disgraced police officer Wayne Couzens pled guilty to kidnap and murder, thousands of women all over England, specifically Clapham Common and Bristol, assembled on Saturday to commemorate a vigil for the murdered marketing executive. As gender-based violence and inequity towards women during COVID heighten, the irony of violently attacking peaceful female protesters chanting "Shame on you" emphasized the mistrust in the policing law by over-policing their right to women's bodies and voices, breaching Article 11 by exercising disproportionate action, which was more violent and unnecessarily inappropriate. The convoluted coronavirus legislations to protesting have created tensions. Intimidating police tactics use oppressive policing systems designed to shut out women's reports on assault, encapsulating its bias through the police's systematic abuse towards women protesters. As Patsy Evans was detained and pinned to the floor, many others were pushed against a tree, fined, handcuffed, and arrested as police trampled flowers and candles. Using Della Porta's model, police implemented the total isolation of troublemakers tactic to control protesters' movement through manhandling, sensing the atmosphere shift from vigil to demonstration, provoking an outbreak of violence which ironically infringed social distancing rules. In Clapham Common, this respectful vigil for Sarah became tarnished with an enraged sense of penal justice, especially after they charged former ringer on the bandstand, silencing voices. The coronavirus lockdown provided the police reasons to amplify these heavy-handed strategies to strengthen their internal domination over females while also keeping the other in check, reiterated by their intersectional racial bias towards black women during the Everard protests and the culture of misogyny isolating their human right to safely navigate UK streets as second-class citizens. Unconscious intersectional bias drives police to stigmatize women of colour through minimized safeguarding, as many were arrested at the vigils aggressively. The timeless abuse of black women by police go unheard, especially the excessive force used against them during BLM protests. Thus, police aggravate social tensions by failing to engage with protesters' messages, symbolizes the antagonist of solidarity for greater protection for health and women's rights to stop tolerating abuse during the 21st century. Policing is power, ironically countering Articles 11 for human rights of protesting, freedom of assembly and association. They reject this art of policing a free democracy to tighten their grip on suppressing minority voices, increasing the de facto physical brutality for Sarah's vigil-goers under the guise of traditional low policing to enforce public safety by maintaining lockdown orders and social distancing. However, the police weren't circumventing Article 11 during Sarah's vigil, where they can impose lawful restrictions to protest and maintain public safety. But they were unable to balance the persuasion which allowed Sarah's vigil to continue, only exacerbating Della Porta's unnecessary, forceful, Machiavellian crackdown. When the vigil turned into a rally circumventing the right to these women's peaceful protesting, assembly and solidarity for a woman murdered by their very own Met officer. The UK government and Met Police Chief Cressida Dick introduced a new police bill, strengthening policing power and arm of the carceral state, imposing further restrictions on disruptive protests, like imposing start and finish times, setting noise limits, fining for refusing orders, and criminalising protesters who intentionally and recklessly cause public nuisance. However, police can circumvent these limitations for public safety by wielding excessive force to tackle non-violent protesters, ironically decreasing women protesters' safety net in voicing their opinions against male violence. Legally, police aren't breaching human rights to freedom of expression either, as police can impose penalties and act as public health agents if they perceive protesters as fueling disorder and threatening citizens' health during coronavirus. But police's morally transgressive behavior threatens women's rights who dare speak out against police harassment and institutional change, fostering more resentment in taking advantage of their weakness. The bill challenges rights to liberty and security through intensified policing power to control COVID protests, subjugating female protesters' rights to fair trial on speaking out against police mistreatment, now legalized by the government, prioritizing safety against morality. Policing involves tactically diffusing boiling social tensions triggered by, well, policing. In the city which saw the statue of Edward Colston pulled down by BLM protesters, Bristol erupted into violent disorder between riot police and protesters against the bill, tarnishing the powerful message of solidarity and protection that Reclaim the Streets demonstrated for. Here, Delaporte's ritualized standoff allowed the combat gear-clad police to beat protesters with riot shields and batons, charging with horses. Yet, the protesters were branded by newspapers as thugs wreaking mob havoc, manipulated by government narratives no less, to strategically incapacitate protesters' full rights to Article 11, defending the new policing bill's integrity. Thus, militarized repressive strategies forces public trust to be weakened in the climate of police corruption, targeting the marginalized to compliance who are weakest in terms of government support, favoring an enhanced policing power of controlling minority rights to their freedom, body, and public space, constrained during rebellious protests. Whilst this is the case, it can be construed that the police are just doing their job, protecting the public from the pandemic, which so far has killed more than 127,000 people. As fall guys of the government's corona policies, tactically policing depends on protesters' broad allowances of reasonable excuses. Many officers condemned the Everard violence, however, but protesters' responsibility to uphold the solidarity in keeping corona under control transfers the morality of exercising the freedom to voice the violent injustices bubbling behind this pandemic. Coronavirus rules of lockdown and public distancing versus the human rights to freedom of protest and expression are not symbiotic. COVID has illuminated the institutionalized abuse. We must condemn and ignite a national conversation about the rights of women on their bodies, movement, social spaces, and protection in daily life, unobstructed by the judgment of men, making the streets safer for women, free from harassment, violence, and murder. Frighteningly, at least 112 women have been murdered since the first lockdown in March. More citizens at home increases the time to voice intensifying grievances and public attention towards proactively fighting for social justice. Clashing between police maintaining lawful social order, impinging on the freedom of expression, versus protesters holding the people in power to account. Both Sarah Everard and BLM protesters' 93% peaceful protesting snowballed into systematic abuse of power. And to maintain public order, they target the weakest minority groups to compliance through a convoluted watchman policing tactic. My video essay catalyzes the nation's duty to avenge Sarah, ensuring to fight for our human rights to protest and expression against authority and create social camaraderie while peaceably shielding public health.